Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Storaasli Lecture. I'm Dr. William Harrison, President of Lutheran Theological Seminary, and I'm pleased to be part of hosting you this evening. We bring a special welcome to Dr. Cody Sanders, who comes to us from LutherSeminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Dr. Driedger-Hesslein will be introducing Dr. Sanders to you a little bit later. Let us begin by acknowledging our relationship to the Indigenous peoples in our places. LTS is based in Saskatoon. From this place, we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis people. We reaffirm our relations, which we are bound to by our ancestors through treaty, to steward this land and seek mutual benefit for as long as the grass grows, the sun shines, and the river flows. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and honor elders and survivors as we bring awareness to Indian residential and day schools, the 60s scoop, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited. To acknowledge this territory and its keepers on their traditional terms is to act in reciprocity so that truth may be understood and reconciliation made possible. We are thankful to Dr. Olav K. Storaasli for his service to LTS and to Canadian Lutheranism, and for the generosity that he and his wife, Lila, showed in the creation of the Storaasli Lecture Series. From 1953 to 1959, Dr. Storaasli was president of Luther Theological Seminary, one of two predecessor institutions that would merge to form Lutheran Theological Seminary. Ordained in 1942, Dr. Storaasli and his wife had arrived in Saskatoon in 1944, and he first served both as pastor of Zion Lutheran Church and as professor of New Testament at the seminary. A pioneer of Lutheran theological education on the Canadian prairies, Dr. Storaasli was a key member of the group that worked to unite Saskatoon's Lutheran seminaries, a dream that was fully realized in 1965. He successfully hosted the International Luther League Convention in Saskatoon in 1949. As a pastor, professor, and president, Dr. Storaasli was a mentor and friend to many ELCIC pastors. Although Dr. Storaasli left to take a call as professor of New Testament at LutherSeminary in St. Paul, where he taught until 1986, he maintained lifelong ties with the seminary in Saskatoon. In 2000, he and his wife Lila endowed a mission lectureship at Lutheran Theological Seminary so that the Saskatoon and U.S. seminaries, with special love for LutherSeminary in St. Paul, might be tied closer together in the common mission of the church. In the video greetings he sent to the 2005 Storaasli lecture, Dr. Storaasli remembered having preached at his ordination on Romans 1, 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. This text, he said, had become the motto of my ministry, the basic statement of my life belief in the gospel. Dr. Storaasli's years of championing and guiding the project of providing a pastorally trained, theologically equipped cadre for generations of ministry in the ELCIC and its predecessor bodies were, and will continue to be, fruitful well beyond his years of dedicated active service to Lutheran Theological Seminary. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We believe that tonight's lecture honors the heritage that we receive from Dr. Storaasli.
Thank you. Well, I am very pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. Cody Sanders, he, him, this evening. Dr. Sanders is the Associate Professor of Congregational and Community Care Leadership at LutherSeminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He teaches pastoral and spiritual care within congregational and community contexts, particularly responding to emerging issues that include climate collapse and political turmoil, which are unfortunately pressing issues these days. He is also a strong advocate for LGBTQIA+ justice and care, and he has just published Spiritual Care First Aid, an all-hands approach for church and community, which is available through Fortress. And so it is in the context of congregational and community care that I invited Dr. Sanders to speak with us this evening on the topic of Christian nationalism, as we in Canada enter into a federal election period where there are multiple factors at work in shaping the outcome of our election. So welcome, Dr. Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I really appreciate the invitation to talk about a topic that doesn't bring me a lot of joy to talk about, but that is a topic that is necessary to discuss. And I'll just say a little bit more about myself autobiographically to situate where I am in this conversation. I grew up in South Carolina, in the southeastern United States, and have lived kind of all over the United States at this point, from Massachusetts to California, and now I'm here in Minnesota. I'm an ordained Baptist minister coming out of a Southern tradition of Baptists, and I think that situates me in a particular way too in this discussion of Christian nationalism. And in my work here at Luther and at other places I've taught, I have been under the conviction that we should not be sending our students out into their ministry contexts without having had a really careful and robust opportunity to discuss white Christian nationalism and the ways that it is shaping our political landscape in the US, and now I think your political landscape in Canada, and the ways that this intersects with our particular communities of the congregations and other institutions that our students are serving. I think we do them a disservice not to teach about white Christian nationalism. So while this isn't a passion of mine, it isn't something I wish that I needed to research and talk about, it is something that I think is vital for us to discuss as Christian leaders, as ministers, as seminarians, as professors in theological institutions. So I appreciate the opportunity and appreciate all of you coming to do this together this evening. And I'm really looking forward to the end when we have some conversation and Q&A. I'm going to share my screen and kind of go through a few things that I think are helpful tonight. And one further word of situating myself in this larger conversation. So my discipline is practical theology or pastoral theology. So I'm very interested in the intersection of theology and the social sciences. So as I talk about Christian nationalism, I'm not going to talk all that much about the kind of theological content of Christian nationalism. And you'll see in my own definition of Christian nationalism, I think it is more of a political mindset and movement than it is a theological or religious one in many ways. So what I'm going to talk most about, I think, that hopefully will be helpful for you, is the way that our social and psychological worlds are intersecting with our socio-political landscape and our theological narratives to bring about what we are seeing in the influence of white Christian nationalism on our political landscapes. Let me share my screen with you and just take you through a few of these pieces that I think would be helpful for us to consider tonight. Let me just hide this little meeting control. There we go. So just three orienting themes to let you know a little bit about where we're headed in this discussion tonight. The first is that I really hope that we can expand beyond an understanding of Christian nationalism that blames an other. I think it's really, really easy for us to point at the people that we perceive as the problem and let that be the totality of our critique of the problem of Christian nationalism. But I think there's a way in which we are all bound up in this kind of complex tangle of influences that has brought about Christian nationalism as a political force in both of our countries. I also want to expand beyond the ideological focus and the theological focus of Christian nationalism, because we really are not going to be able to think or argue or convince our way out of this problem. There are some complexities to it, I think, psychologically, that are really important to note, that will hopefully help you see other avenues beyond just arguing over the ideological or political or theological content of Christian nationalism. And the other piece I want to lean into is an expansion of our vision for what we're able to see when we look at this complex picture of white Christian nationalism, because this isn't a monolithic movement. This isn't a very cohesive political mindset or orientation. This isn't an exceptionally robust kind of theological framework. There's a lot of complexities to this picture that don't lend themselves to simple stories about what it's about or how we resolve some of the issues it's creating. So let me just give you my brief definition. Well, maybe it's not so brief. It actually has turned into kind of a complex definition, but hopefully one that's helpful in seeing what we talk about as Christian nationalism with a little more clarity. An anti-democratic or authoritarian political movement that is infused with Christian language and symbols, bolstering a politics of nostalgia that privileges white Christian cultural hegemony. And I think it's really important to highlight here that, at least in the way I'm looking at Christian nationalism, it is a political movement more than a theological movement, but it is a political movement that has this very clear Christian linguistic and symbolic overlay to it. And it's also, I think, important at this point, especially in the way that it is evolving in the US context, to note that you don't need to be a Christian to be a Christian nationalist or to support Christian nationalist ideologies or movements. It is strengthened by the power, it is strengthening the power, wealth, and authority of leadership of this movement. That's both thought leaders and political leaders in this movement, whose aims and motivations are often misaligned with the masses that make up the movement itself. So the masses of voters, the masses of people who show up in public spaces to support messages of Christian nationalism. It's become really clear, if you're looking carefully at the political landscape of in the US right now, that the powerful, influential political and thought leaders in the kind of Christian nationalist or kind of far right movement have a stake in this that is quite different from what many in the larger masses of voters have, and that's bound up with political power, with the accumulation of wealth, and the solidification of authority. And Christian nationalism thrives on inequality, tenuous social relationships, and the fragmentation of communal bonds, where mutual understanding and tolerance for difference are usually cultivated. So when inequality is increasing and social relationships are breaking down and our community bonds are eroding, that is the recipe socially and psychologically that gives rise to the possibilities of something like Christian nationalism coming about. This is one area we're going to get into in much more depth as we go this evening. And Christian nationalism operates on the fuel of resentment, of cynicism, and of fear, and is animated by a mindset that's shaped by misinformation and disinformation that is often impervious to reason based on facts and a sense of shared reality. This is one way in which I think it's helpful to note that the way I look at any kind of problem that I'm addressing with my academic discipline of practical theology is to look at it with a bio-psycho-spiritual, eco-techno-social perspective, because all of those things are vitally important for understanding what we're looking at when we look at a lived human situation. And in this case, this notion of a mindset that's shaped by misinformation and disinformation that's often impervious to reason, and that isn't based on a shared sense of reality, brings in the technological component of how we're seeing Christian nationalism take shape and take hold in the minds and lives of many people in the U.S. context. And I imagine also you might see some of your own neighbors in that kind of broad picture there. And we're going to get more into that detail a bit as we go as well. So these are the three ways that I think that some of the ways that I'm looking at Christian nationalism differ from perhaps what you might have encountered in your own reading and study about this ideology or movement. That I think that there's something about it that is rooted in a crisis of belonging. That cynicism and the erosion of trust are a major part of how Christian nationalism starts to become influential in the lives of people in our communities, and that anger turned toward rage and resentment is sort of the emotional or affective fuel of Christian nationalism. We're going to get more into each of those as we go, but keep those in mind as just orienting areas of inquiry for us. So while all Christian nationalism isn't extremism, and in fact, most people who in your life would probably be influenced by Christian nationalist thought and movement don't even necessarily know they're Christian nationalists. They might not have ever considered that term. There is, I think, some helpful psychological research about extremism that I want to lift up here that I think is helpful to see how people become lured into Christian nationalist movements and mentalities over the course of time. So some most significant risk factors for leaning into more extremist political movements are unmet psychological needs that are often caused by experiences of humiliation and disrespect. In the US political landscape, you can see this notion of humiliation and disrespect growing over the course of the last few years in political discourse in the ways that particularly white men are being led to think about our life in the world, in our country, and the ways that others are being blamed and scapegoated for this kind of production of a notion of humiliation and disrespect. Times of psychological distress, times when we're emerging from a recent crisis, and a sense of loss of significance. And I think the loss of significance is another piece that you can see in the more political propaganda that is helping Christian nationalism to take root here. In addition to these risk factors and vulnerabilities to extremism, I want to talk a little bit at the outset, just to sort of set this framework for how we're looking at the problem of Christian nationalism, of the ways narratives and networks play into vulnerabilities for our friends and neighbors, our church members, being lured into Christian nationalist movements and mentalities. Unmet needs, moments of chaos and pain, are met with narratives that provide overly simplistic explanations for these times of chaos and pain and unmet needs. And they typically offer us someone else to blame. This is a really easy thing to see if you're paying attention to the kind of political propaganda that tries to even create a sort of constant sense of emergency and chaos, and then meets that constant sense of emergency and chaos with a simple explanation about why that is happening in our lives in the world and who is to blame for it. In the US, that blame right now is most heavily being heaped on the shoulders of immigrants in our country and trans people in our country. There are simple stories that are being conveyed in political messages and in more conservative media outlets about the ways that immigrants or the ways that trans people are producing these experiences of chaos or social pain and things of that nature. So these narratives offer simplistic ways of thinking that see the world in black and white terms. It's a really important way in which Christian nationalism, I think, gets picked up in the larger social sphere, is that it offers an easy story to believe. Complexity is usually not helpful in convincing people to move toward Christian nationalism. The simplest narrative, an explanation about whatever the problem is, even if that problem is produced in propaganda, whatever that problem is, if it can have a simple story to be told about it, that's the one that's usually effective in getting people into a mentality or mindset of Christian nationalism. And then a network of others holding similar views provides a sense of belonging and sometimes the permission structure that justifies violence. We'll talk more about this when we talk about some social research that I want to introduce in a few minutes. But the ways that social media provides a ready network of others who share our similar views, that we can access those networks really easily. And the only thing we really have in common with those networks oftentimes is a shared affinity or affiliation, a political affiliation, a religious affiliation. And that network provides more than just the justification of our views. It also provides us a sense of belonging. And remember that one of the factors that I think is really undergirding Christian nationalism's ascent is a crisis of belonging. So these networks of others holding similar affinities, similar affiliations, similar views provide a sense of belonging that feels good to our body minds because we are built for social belonging. Evolutionarily speaking. And just to note that I think this piece of research is really fascinating. The Department of Justice in the United States in 2010, so 2010 is around the advent of the smartphone and the ways that we all now carry the entire world in our pockets and can access these networks at any time. Prior to 2010, it took about 63.95 months for someone to be radicalized by any kind of extremist movement. After 2010, that amount of time to radicalization reduced by 18.53 months. So the acceleration that smartphone technology provided for the adoption of radical views, and again, not every Christian nationalist should be fit into this box of radicalization, but I think this research really helps to see how quickly someone can be lured into a network of others who share these similar views that provide a sense of belonging and a justification for our adoption of these simple stories that help us make sense of whatever crisis we think we are in the world, some of them real crises and some of them manufactured. This is a book that I really wanted to introduce you to tonight because among the just dozens and dozens of books that are coming out right now about white Christian nationalism, this is one that I think has a kind of unique vantage point. Elizabeth Newman is an evangelical Christian, but she's not a theologian or a social scientist. She served as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security in the early years of the Trump administration, and sort of had an inside look at the ways that that the politics of rage and resentment fueled Christian nationalist movements. And she says the most dangerous threat or the most dangerous extreme of nationalism is when it merges with arguments that a nation's religion, ethnicity, or race must be protected from being polluted by outsiders, often framed as less than human invaders. And if you're paying attention to US political discourse right now, you see that very language of pollution and invasion being used consistently in political rhetoric. And it is typically framed as a threat to Christian supremacy, Christian hegemony, and white racial supremacy or hegemony. So I really commend this book to you because I think she has a vantage point that is a bit different from a lot of the other books that are coming out right now on the subject. This is a social, or rather a philosophical figure that many of you are probably familiar with, Hannah Arendt. She studied the rise of totalitarianism in Nazi Germany after World War II. One of the ways that she, in her origins of totalitarianism, named the social landscape that gave rise to the Nazi ascent was what she called organized loneliness. I think this is an especially pressing concern for us right now to pay attention to, because what Arendt points to is that the way that loneliness, which she said was once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses in our century. And that experience of the proliferation of loneliness in our everyday life, to her mind, gave rise to totalitarianism in Germany. About 3 years ago, the Surgeon General of the United States came out with a really helpful advisory called Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, which demonstrated that about 1 in 2 people in the US experience some form of loneliness. That is, not having the quality or quantity of social connections that they desired to have. I looked at some of the statistics for Canada. It looks like Canada is doing a little bit better in this loneliness epidemic, but the research that I found from 2021 in Canada suggests that about 40% of Canadians, so a little less than the US, but about 40% of Canadians experience some degree of moderate to severe loneliness. And that is greatest in the population of people 18 to 35 years old in Canada. That kind of age range mirrors what's happening in the US as well. So I want to take this notion of organized loneliness and play it out a bit in terms of how we are experiencing what Hannah Arendt pointed to back in the 40s today, but quite a bit differently. And I want to do that with the work of Mark Dunkelman. If you know his work, you probably know it through this book, The Vanishing Neighbor, which he wrote about a decade ago, about the shifting landscapes of the social context in the US. I think this is really helpful for us to keep in mind, especially if we are Christian leaders in local communities, if we're pastors of churches, or if we're embedded in a community that is looking at the ways that we increase a sense of belonging for people. So what Dunkelman points to is these three circles of relationship. He calls this inner circle of family and close friends the circle of blood and intimacy. So these are the people who are our family members, either biological family or chosen family. They're our closest friends. They're the people that we relate to out of a sense of love, a sense of deep belonging. This outer circle he calls our tribe. Those are the people who share affinities with us. They're people who share our political affiliation, our religious ideology, our national identity, things of that sort. They're not necessarily people we know in our everyday lives, but they're people who share something with us in the larger social sphere. This middle ring, Dunkelman calls the village. These are relationships that are familiar but not intimate. So these are people in our everyday lives. These are the people that we see at the grocery store, at the barbershop, or at the library, or anywhere we go in our daily life, in the stores and shops that we visit. They're neighbors. They're people who live near us. They're people who we encounter in third spaces in our everyday lives. Dunkelman's research showed, well, firstly, I forgot this piece. He says that we typically learn love within that inner circle of family and close friends. We typically learn loyalty in that outer ring of shared affinities. And we typically learn tolerance from those in the familiar but not intimate village, because those are the people who are most likely to be different from us. in political affiliation and religious ideology and national identity and all sorts of ways. But they're people in our everyday life. They're people we encounter and have to get along with in some way. We may have disagreements with them, but we have to live with them because they're in our village of familiar but not intimate relationships. What Dunkelman found was that these inner rings and outer rings in our lives were both strengthened by the trend of people spending more time at home and on their phones and social media, what he calls individualizing technologies. So over the course of several decades in the US, people were spending more time at home rather than out in public spaces. He looked at things like the rate of takeout versus dine-in restaurant experiences. So you can imagine that if you're spending more time at home, that inner circle of love, the family, the close friends, is growing because those are the people you're spending time with when you spend time at home rather than in public. But the interesting part of that research is that these individualizing technologies like the smartphone and social media also increased our connection to that inner circle, because when we were out in public, we could be talking with our close family and friends, texting, sharing things on social media with them. I can know what my family is eating 1,000 miles away for dinner because we have a shared family Snapchat, that outer ring of the shared affinities was also strengthened by social media and phone individualizing technologies like the phone, as you might imagine, because we are suddenly really, really well connected to a whole lot of people that we would never know in our daily lives. But they are people for whom there is something about their life that intersects ours. We share the same political party. We share the same religious identity. We share an interest in knitting. We share an interest in this video game that we all play. And that might be our only connection to them, this one affinity that we have. And that one thing alone can strengthen this outer ring relationship bond with people that we will never encounter in real life, but we encounter every day on our social media. But what he also found was that these individualizing technologies and the trends of spending more time at home led to the erosion of that middle ring. This is the ring of social cohesion. It was the one that most quickly broke down as people spent more time at home and more time engaging with the individualizing technologies of television earlier on and smartphone and social media later on in the research. So you see the problem here. The inner ring where we learn love for those who are most closest to us, most like us, and the outer ring where we learn loyalty to people who share identities and affinities with us are being ever strengthened. And this inner ring where we learn tolerance from people who are in our everyday lives, people who we would normally encounter in third spaces and neighborhoods and things of that nature, where we would learn tolerance because we are different from these people, but we have to get along with them. We have to live side by side with them in some way. As we are less and less living side by side with them, that place where we most learn tolerance is eroding. And this was observed even in research that was done, like, for example, in a public park in New York City, where social science researchers and their graduate students sat and observed people over the course of time who were with one another in this public space, but who were entirely engrossed in their phones or in social media or something of that sort, even while they were in that public space with other people, but they weren't actually encountering them. They weren't engaging with them. This, I think, for us, is what we need to pay attention to when we look at Hannah Arendt's research on organized loneliness, and to really become aware of the ways that our own lives have become lonelier and lonelier, even as we are more robustly connected in a technological way. So this is one factor that I want us to keep in mind as we move into the sort of social and psychological factors that help bolster white Christian nationalism. The other that I want to point you to, because this is happening in a really, really clear way right now in the U.S., and I am not as aware of how it is taking shape in Canada. So I want to offer you this notion of organized abandonment from the abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And what she describes as organized abandonment is the dismantling of and divestment from private capitalist structures and public structures that communities depend on, such as schools, public healthcare systems, safe infrastructure. And instead, there's the movement toward moving those investments out of these kind of public structures into law enforcement, which is deployed as the lone remedy for all problems that arise from the deficits that divestment creates. I think a couple months ago, I would have had to explain more about how this takes place, because I've been talking about this notion for the last year or so, and it has taken a lot. It's taken a lot of explanation for people to get what organized abandonment really looks like, unless you come from a BIPOC or lower socioeconomic community, then you know what it looks like. But now all I have to do is just show some recent headlines, and these are all from the US, but you can see really clearly what organized abandonment looks like when it is put into practice. Organized loneliness, organized abandonment. Now I want to just talk a bit about polarization. And the reason I think this is helpful is because we normally only talk about this first type of polarization, and I don't think it is the most influential style of polarization that we're experiencing in our socio-political sphere right now. Ideological polarization is the actual disagreement that we have between people about policy issues. There is that polarization, but I don't know that that is the polarization that is most behind the ascent of white Christian nationalism. The other two, however, are really potent factors right now. The notion of affective polarization. This is the polarization that can be seen in the growing animosity between people in the US. Is typically between either party, Democrats or Republicans. But this is where the politics that is fueled by resentment and anger and grievance comes into play here. We don't even necessarily have to disagree that much ideologically to be led to believe that we are on extreme opposite sides of any particular issue. And you can likely observe this in some of your communities where people who have lived together for decades in the same city, the same town, the same church, etc., suddenly believe that the people who they may differ with about some ideological political concern are more and more being treated as an enemy, that we are enraged that they would differ from us on X, Y, or Z thing. Then the third area that I want to point you to is this notion of false polarization. So this is the polarization that's due to the degree to which partisans overestimate the ideological division between their side and other opponents. And there's a lot of really helpful psychological and social psychological research that suggests that we nearly always overestimate the degree to which we hold different views from people on the opposite side of whatever the divide is. So the notion of false polarization is this increase in our sense of polarization that is not actually rooted in an ideological disagreement. move on from that a bit to introduce you to this framework that Monica Guzman has written about in her work. I never thought of it that way. If there's one book that I would recommend to you that would help you to talk to people in your life who are being lured by the movement of Christian nationalism, it would be this one. Guzman is a liberal journalist, second generation Mexican American. Her parents are first generation immigrants from Mexico, and they are Trump voters. And Guzman wrote this book in order to help other people who are in situations like hers, where they have some deep divide within their own family or friendship circles or communities, but they want to stay in relationship with those people. So Guzman wrote this book to help us think through the ways that we can be most effective in talking across divides that arise, whether they're in our family or in our church or in our larger community. And I want to go through some things that she offers, because I think, practically speaking, this might be some of the most helpful stuff that you encounter tonight, because it's something that you can take directly back into your life and use. These are just three things that I think she names so well that I don't want us to lose. The first, that I've already mentioned early on, is that trying to change people's minds when you don't understand them never works. And she says it's never worth it. People are harder to move from our positions on things that matter to us for good reason, because our whole lives have led us here. So she's really helping us to be oriented toward a posture of deep listening and curiosity when we encounter people who hold vastly different perspectives from us. She says when we genuinely change our minds, it's not because we give in to pressure from someone else. It's not because we decide to reject the power of our own experiences. It's because we tell a new story about our experiences that fits us better. Then she goes on, you can also craft that new story a lot faster in an instant when you see yourself reflected in someone else in a way you didn't expect. So what Guzman does is give us some really helpful tools to take into our own relationships in life, and use in engaging people who differ from us in some way. And I'll just say, these are basically the same kinds of tools that I teach to first-year seminarians in the congregational care class that I teach 3 times a year. They're tools of deep listening. They're tools of humility and less anxious presence. They're tools of compassionate curiosity that we use to help other people tell the stories of their lives and the things that they most want us to know about each other. The reason they're so hard in this situation is because many of the things that we disagree with touch on things that are so deeply important to us. And for some of us, especially like queer people, trans people, people who are being the scapegoats in a lot of the political propaganda, our lives depend on many of these concerns and how they work out in the political process. So one of the hardest parts of this is diminishing our desire to react from the anger that we feel enough to actually hear another person and to understand what they value and how that has led them to the place that they are. So let me just go through a few things that Guzman offers for us to try. And I'd really encourage you, if you are taking notes, write these down, or just take a screenshot or picture of the screen, because these are the kinds of things you should kind of tape on your bathroom mirror and look at periodically. Ask people how they came to believe what they believe. Not just what they believe, which is usually where we spend a lot of time in our conversations with people about disagreements, but how they came to believe it. There's a story there. And you won't be able to help change someone's mind or bring them out of this sort of deep commitment to Christian nationalist ideologies without understanding how they came to be influential for them in the first place. She also encourages us to learn how to explain ourselves with story. So not, again, just sharing what you believe, but sharing the ways that your beliefs have been shaped over the course of time. Tell a story about why it's important to you to hold the position that you do on immigration. Tell a story about why it's important to you to support trans rights. And pull on examples and details. This was really what makes stories rich. The details that have made this particular thing important to you over the course of time. Acknowledge the intersections that you see between your story and someone else's story. Again, false polarization leads us to believe that the people who differ from us on any given issue are really, 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 really different from us, when in fact, there may be a lot of intersections between our lives and our stories and the ways that they've unfolded. And this helps to build traction, helps to build connection, helps to build that relational bond where people can actually hear one another better. She says, speak for yourself, resist speaking for others. That's, I think, one that you should probably kind of see the importance of already. And then share the storytelling role. Invite someone else into the conversation to share their story. And then thank people for sharing their story. Even if you don't come to a place of mutual understanding, express gratitude for the ways that this person has shared their life and their story with you. These are the kinds of tools that I hope we can get more deeply ingrained into our congregations and the communities we serve, that help to build back that middle ring of the village relationships, of the familiar but not intimate, because we have progressively become de-skilled at talking with other people who differ from us and who think differently from us, because we don't really have to do that if we don't want to. We can unfriend anyone who doesn't agree with us on Facebook or social media. We can only talk to people in our lives that have similar politics, similar religious expressions, and things of that nature. So these skills are the ones we need to build back that middle ring of relationships that has progressively become almost non-existent for many people. I'm just going to go through a few other kind of practical tools that you might incorporate into your own ways of conversing with people across difference. We only have about 10 minutes left, so I want to just move through this kind of quickly. So if you want to take photographs or something of these slides, feel free, or you can look back at the recording later. Asking for people's concerns and hopes. This is a way of getting deeper into how people have come to believe X, Y, or Z thing. What they're concerned about related to immigration or related to trans rights or related to whatever the concern is, and what they hope can happen with those things. Guzman said, we have to stop assuming that people who disagree with us don't value what we value. Instead, we have to redirect our curiosity toward a critical question: what do they value more? So understanding the values that are embedded in these differences is a big piece of this. Stating your own concerns, not with what she calls curiosity-crushing certainty, but state it as a personal concern. I'm worried about X. I'm really concerned that Y will have this impact on these people that I love, etc. This invites engagement rather than just arguing across differences. Finding values in people's decisions. Listen for the stories about the choices people make politically, about the values that have gone into making those choices thinkable options for them. Pulling on values that are in tension, because when you notice these in a person's story, you can lift them up into conversation with them. It helps to kind of put in context where you can look with some complexity about the things that they are thinking, or that they're valuing, that might be in tension and might be ways of getting some traction in that conversation. Following emotion. This is a really important one. Again, affective Polarization is, I think, a bigger threat most of the time than ideological polarization. And emotions can reveal a lot about what people are concerned about, what they value, what they hope. I usually spend a lot of time with my students, helping them to pay careful attention to the times that fear and sadness and anger arise in conversation, because when those emotions arise over and over again and are not attended to with care, those can elongate into temperaments of rage, of withdrawal, of a whole bunch of kind of politically troublesome temperaments or moods. This is a really good phrase just to internalize. It sounds like you really care about this. Can you say more about it? Inviting people to tell more of the story that needs to be told, even when it's a really, really hard story to hear. And then changing the question. Avoid going down what Guzman calls the toxic assumption spiral. It says people on the other side are motivated by something that we hate. Instead, listen for what they love and lean into that particular area of their story. So changing your question from why don't you care about the thing that I care about to what do you care about more? What is it that is motivating your attraction to Christian nationalist politicians or something of that sort? And then listening to anger. This is the piece that I think is hardest to do, and I think the piece that is most important. Valerie Carr, anger is the force that protects that which is loved. Anger, when it arises in us, is a signal to us that something that we care very deeply about is being threatened. So when you hear anger arise in the story of another person, that's a clue that you should become curious about what they are protecting with that anger, what seems to be threatened. Now, it's really, really important to note that a lot of the ways that our political landscape right now is producing anger through propaganda, through mis and disinformation about things that are not even necessarily rooted in reality. And yet, the anger itself feels very real to us, even if the thing that we are angry about is rooted in disinformation. So pay careful attention to the ways anger arises for you and when it arises for the person that you're conversing with. Offering perspective into confounding questions. So this is where you can ask some permission from someone to share a different perspective about something. Would you like to hear more about this thing that's really important to me too, and how I came to see it differently? And I think this is a helpful word for us, pausing and persisting. A person's identity, Guzman says, is a common source of attachments, and it isn't something you can simply change. Most of the time we attach to identity-related beliefs because they reflect who we are, but every now and then we attach to identity-related beliefs because they reflect who other people expect us to be. Here's where I think it's really helpful to see how Christian language and symbols and identities gets overlaid onto an anti-democratic authoritarian political movement. Because we are really attached to identities of Christianity, even if we don't necessarily practice Christianity all that seriously. A lot of the research early on from some social scientists that were looking at political affiliation found a lot of people who identify as Christian nationalists don't actually belong to churches necessarily. But there's something really deeply valued about this identity of Christianity or identity of evangelicalism, and often something really deeply rooted about our sense of identity with people for whom we share racial affinities and things of that nature. So these identity-related beliefs can become a really strong motivating factor for people to lean into the direction of authoritarianism and Christian nationalism, even if it means eroding democratic practices and processes. And I hope that helps you see the ways that some of what seems so almost incongruous about what's happening in our political landscapes can take shape. People for whom a Christian identity or a white racial identity is really deeply important to them might be willing to give up some aspects of our democracy, for example. If those things are under threat, and a simple story can be told about why those are under threat, and a simple solution to those threats can be offered by an authoritarian or anti-democratic political leadership. I love this line: we don't see with our eyes, but with our whole biographies. This is why getting really, really good at helping other people tell their stories to you is an important tool for anyone, but certainly for Christian public leaders. As we wrap up here, I just want to give you these book recommendations. I think each of these has a unique vantage point. Belonging Without Othering is a little more academic in its orientation. John Powell is a really great racial justice researcher. Kingdom of Rage, I've mentioned already. If you are trying to figure out how to organize communities in relation to what's happening in our political landscape, Let This Radicalize You by Hayes and Kaba is a must read for you. I honestly think every pastor and Christian leader should read this book. It's not written for pastors or churches, but it is full of the kinds of tools and kinds of stories that you need in order to organize community in relationship to what's happening. And the subtitle, I think, is really helpful: Organizing the Revolution of Reciprocal Care. Take a look at that if you have the chance. Disarming Leviathan is another really unique vantage point on Christian nationalism, because Campbell is the pastor of a large evangelical church in the United States. And when he noticed people in his congregation being lured into Christian nationalism, he had to try to figure out how to speak into that in his congregation, where there was, genuine differences about how people related to Christian nationalism. It's a really helpful book in thinking about how to talk to people who are a part of your own life, but who are being lured into Christian nationalist mentalities. I never thought of it that way. I've quoted from a lot. You should definitely take a look at that. That's a good book read for your church groups. And On Belonging, Kim Samuel is not quite as academically oriented as Belonging Without Othering, but has some really, really helpful social science research and practical implications for the loneliness and isolation epidemic. So 6 books I think would be immediately helpful to you if you took a look at these in the coming days. And then, as was mentioned earlier, this is my new book that I also think would be helpful to your churches, because the orientation of this book is about getting the tools of spiritual care into the hands of people in the pews. I wrote this book because I, for a decade and a half or so before coming to Luther, have been in the parish training lay people to do the congregational care work alongside me and the congregations that I served. And I can never find a sufficient tool to use to do that training. So I just created the tool that I wish that I had had all those years. And all of the tools of deep listening, asking curious and beautiful questions, developing a less anxious presence, along with a lot of tools like what to do when a mental health crisis arises, or what to do when you encounter suicidality or addiction or abuse and violence, etc. All of that very practically laid out here. You could take this and train your lay people with it, and it's laid out in such a way that that training would be really easy to undertake. And this is my email address. If you would like to be in further correspondence with me going forward, I wod welcome that. Just write that down and email me at some point. You can also just find it on the LutherSeminary website under my biography page. And I'd be glad to be a resource to you in any way that I possibly can. I think this is something we need to be in together in the coming days. And I really appreciate this time to talk with you this evening. And I'm looking forward to some conversation with you this evening about what animated your own imagination and curiosity during this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanders. That was you walked us through a lot of stuff, and all of it was important. So I'm glad this is being recorded, because I think I'm going to have to go back and watch it again. And we do actually in one of our theology classes do use Let This Radicalize You. So it's good to
Oh,
have
wow. That's
reinforcement
great.
for the students. Yeah. So at this point, I'm just going to stop the recording.